When it comes to alcohol and drug use, the stigma is huge. And the stigma is a real problem for those of us who do provide treatment, because it's trying to get through to society at large, but also to the individual that, look, you are not a bad person. You are a person with a problem, we're here to help you. But also to say something to wider society, to say to society that if you want good outcomes, you have to think about what policies you support as a society.
I felt I had a pretty good relationship with all my kids. We were a middle-class family living on the leafy north shores of Sydney. Things were pretty good, and I figured that all my kids were happy. And then my son Damien came to me and told me that I was on heroin. Families more than anybody, except the drug user, suffer the consequences. We are marginalised, we are stigmatised. The families I speak to cannot speak to their workmates and friends. They cannot speak to their neighbours. They reach out often to doctors and priests, and they get the same negative impact from them because they're all part of this community that really places drug users lower than murderers. We don't have hanging anymore, but we do believe that if a drug user dies from an overdose, well, they brought it on themselves and it's their own fault.
Well, how do people get into drug use? Now, many of the decision makers would like a model like this, something that's simple, straightforward. There's the answer. And I can relate to that one. Daddy drinks because I cry. But of course, it's not as simple as that. Despite the fact that many of the decision makers, many of the politicians, many in the community would have it that way, it's actually far more complex. So we have to ask the question, how do they get into it? And of course, there are multiple factors why people get into it. For example, simply looking at some of the treatment services I was responsible for in WA, about 70% of all the women in those treatment services have been sexually abused. To simply say we need a stronger criminal response to illicit drug use amongst those women might not have been a particularly effective way to respond to the drug problems.
It's very hard to express ill mental health issues, psychosis, if you haven't experienced it. Almost impossible, I think. I have a few friends today that have experienced the same thing, and we have a bond that not many other people share. You know, sick, desperate. I weighed little more than 50 kgs, and I didn't know what to do. So I did the thing I knew the best to cure my headspace, my loneliness, my anguish. Go to the pub. You know? And I continued on doing what I did best, using and abusing substances as hard and as fast as I could. This didn't last long, you know. I don't know what the experience was that brought me out of it.
Why do people initially give up? Well, it can probably be summed up in that simple sentence, and in fact that was a statement from a client in Glasgow once. It's just not worth it anymore. There's an accumulation of adverse consequences that tip the balance in favour of change, at least for now. But what we also know is that some people can then make the change more readily than others, and that can be summed up in terms of social capital, your internal and your external resources. Those people who have supportive families around them, supportive communities, have a head start on people who don't. So social capital matters. There is a discrimination in the ability of people, or some discrimination in the ability of people to commence and maintain change.
You're not always able to say, well, the best thing for you is you give up, yeah? Well, of course, the best things for that person is they give up, but it's not going to happen today, tomorrow, or in the immediate future. In the meantime, you've got to work with that continuing use, try and keep that person alive, try and keep them with a pathway that works for them. Now, many aspects of this working with continuous use, classic ones, needle exchange programs, outreach work, low threshold engagement, wet houses if you're talking about people with alcohol problems, these can't work if law enforcement professionals are not supportive of them. Yeah, there's plenty of examples around the world where very well funded, very well planned needle exchanges, to use an example, have been absolute disaster because there's a police car across the road.
It was mentioned before about if things don't get better, then why bother? Things didn't get better. You know, my first 2 months prior to treatment, I wanted to die. It was horrible. The drugs didn't work. Being sober didn't work. What do you do in a situation like that? You know, hence the treatment came in. You know, and I came out of that treatment centre on the 31st of December 2007. You know, and since then it's been, to say the least, a bumpy ride. A very bumpy ride.
When you are able to support a person with an intervention, or call it treatment, call it partnership, call it walking alongside, whatever you want to call it, but when you can do that effectively, what is gained? There are really extraordinary gains in that a person who has been excluded from society, who does not participate, can then be brought back into participating, and you can restore the contribution that they can make to the community. So rather than taking resources from the community, they give back into a contribution to the community.
When families learn that they can cope and they can manage and they can live with drug use, everything changes. They go on with their own lives, they have their other relationships, their hobbies and activities, which they've often discarded while they're trying to struggle with the problem. They have better communication, they are understanding what's going on, they're listening to what's going on, they're using I statements instead of you statements. And they've got effective boundaries in place, they've got harm minimization skills, harm reduction skills that keep people safe and alive. The outcome is that they function better, and even though the drug user may not be always drug-free, our experience in dealing with literally thousands of families is that if the family's healthier, the drug user's healthier.
Different types of treatment have different types of success rates or containment rates, but by and large, if you put 1,000 people through drug treatment in the UK, we found out that good proportions, and I would say 30–40% is the general benchmark we'd be looking at, would be making significant changes to their offending behaviour. And that's a pretty good return in terms of any social policy. And in fact, there was a study done, a comparative study a couple of years ago in the UK that looked at the whole range of potential interventions you could take to try and reduce crime in our society, and the one that came out with the best bang for the buck was drug treatment for people who are dependent on drugs.
One of the magical aspects of drugs is that drug use does confer upon you some magical properties of a sense of belonging. A lot of drug use is surrounded by rituals, sometimes like smoking a pipe. I think it's only ritual, but there's an enormous amount of sense of belonging that goes with it. That means that change is going to require an enormous creation or enormous effort to create a sense of belonging in the, if you like, the straight life. So the pull out of the old life needs to be substantial. So while clinical support is important and sometimes critical, it's also what happens in the person's world. So nurturing friends and family, the importance of other networks, and maybe that's why things like NA and AA can be very important to some people. It provides the social and support networks that otherwise they don't have.
Everybody is capable of change. And the big lesson I had through the 80s when I was a young sort of green outreach worker was that I always remember thinking, and you're young and enthusiastic, and you're thinking, well, I can identify, because I'm a professional, I've been to college, I can identify the people who are capable of change and are going to be the ones to put my efforts into, and those ones aren't. Got it wrong every time, yeah? People are just so confusing, they're so unpredictable.